Book 1, Chapter 6 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus, of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 6. The Most High manifests to Mary, our Mistress, additional mysteries, and shows her the works of the sixth day of creation. While the Most High continued the proximate preparation of our heavenly Princess for the reception of the eternal Word in her virginal womb, she, on her part, persevered without intermission in her fervent sighs and prayers to hasten his coming into the world. When the night of the sixth of these days, which I have begun to describe, had arrived, and when she had previously been elevated by still more profound illuminations, she was again called and invited in spirit to the abstractive vision of the Divinity. Although this happened in the same manner as at other times, yet it was accompanied by more heavenly effects and by a more profound insight into the attributes of the Most High. She remained 9 hours in this trance and issued from it at the 3rd hour. Yet although the high vision of the essence of God ceased at that hour, the most holy Mary continued to enjoy another kind of vision and prayer. This was indeed inferior to the first, but in itself was most exalted and more excellent than that experienced by any of the saints or the just. The gifts and favors so far described partook more and more of the divine during the last days preceding the Incarnation, without at the same time being a hindrance to the active occupations of her married state, for here Martha had no right to complain when Mary forsook her in her ministrations. Luke 10:40. Having seen God in this vision, she was immediately shown the works on the sixth day of the creation of the world. She witnessed, as if she herself had been present, how at the command of the Lord the earth brought forth the living beings according to their kinds, as Moses says. Genesis 1:24. Holy Scripture here refers to the terrestrial animals, which, being more perfect than the fishes and birds in life and activity, are called by a name signifying the more important part of their nature. She saw and understood all the kinds and species of animals, which were created on this sixth day, and by what name they were called: some, beasts of burden, because they serve and assist man; others, wild beasts, as being more fierce and untamed; others, reptiles, because they do not raise themselves or very little from the earth. She knew and comprehended the qualities of all of them, their fury, their strength, the useful purposes which they serve, and all their distinctions and singularities. Over all these she was invested with dominion, and they were commanded to obey her. She could, without opposition on their part, have trodden upon asps and basilisks, for all would have meekly borne her heel. Many times did some of these animals show their subjection to her commands, as when, at the birth of her most holy Son, the ox and the ass prostrated themselves, and by their breaths warmed the infant God at the command of his blessed Mother. In this plenitude of knowledge and science, our heavenly Queen understood perfectly the secret ways of God in making all creation serve for the benefit of man, and how much man owes to his Creator on this account. And it was most proper that she should possess this knowledge and understanding, so that with it she might be able to give fitting thanks for such blessings. Neither men nor angels have done so, failing to correspond and falling short of their duty in this regard. All these voids were filled by the Queen of all, and she satisfied for the debt of gratitude, which we could not or would not pay. Through her, divine equity was duly satisfied, considering her as a medium between itself and the creatures. By her innocence and gratitude, she became more pleasing to his Majesty than all the rest of the creatures. The mysterious advent of God into the world was thus being prepared, for the last hindrance was removed by the sanctification of her, who was to be his mother. After seeing the creation of all the irrational creatures, she became aware how the most blessed Trinity, in order to complete and perfect the world, said: "Let us make man to our image and likeness." Genesis 1:26. And how by virtue of this divine decree, the first man was formed of the earth as the first parent of all the rest. She had a profound insight in the harmonious composition of the human body and soul and of their faculties, of the creation and infusion of the soul into the body and of its intimate union with the body. Of the structure of the human body and all its parts, she obtained a deep knowledge. She was informed of the number of the bones, veins, arteries, nerves, and ligatures, of the concourse of humors to compose the befitting temperaments, the faculties of nutrition, growth, and locomotion. She learned in what manner the disturbances or changes in this harmony cause the sicknesses, and how these can be cured. All this the most prudent Virgin understood and comprehended without the least error, better than all the wise men of the world, and better than even the angels. The Lord manifested to her also the happy state of original justice, in which He placed the first parents, Adam and Eve. She understood their condition, beauty and perfection of innocence and grace, and for how short a time they persevered in it. She perceived how they were tempted and overcome by the astuteness of the serpent. Genesis 2:51. And what were the consequences of their sin, and how great were the fury and hate of the demon against the human race. At the vision of all these things, our Queen made great and heroic acts of virtue, highly pleasing to God. She understood that she was a daughter of these first parents, and that she descended from a nature so thankless to its Creator. In the remembrance of this, she humiliated herself in his divine presence, thereby wounding the heart of God and obliging Him to raise her above all that is created. She took it upon herself to weep for the first sin and for all the rest that followed from it, as if she herself had been guilty of them all. Hence, even at that time, that first sin might have been called a fortunate fault, which caused tears so precious in the eyes of the Lord, and which earned us such sureties and pledges of our redemption. Rendering worthy thanks to the Creator for the magnificent work of the creation of man, she reflected deeply on his disobedience, the seduction and deception of Eve, and she inwardly resolved to yield that perpetual obedience which these first parents had refused to their Creator. So acceptable in his eyes was this subjection, that his Majesty in the presence of the heavenly courtiers decreed the immediate fulfillment and execution of that which was prefigured in the history of the king Assuerus, by whom the Queen Vashti was repudiated and deprived of royal dignity on account of disobedience, while the humble and gracious Esther was raised to her place. Esther 7:2. There was an admirable similarity between that event and these mysteries. For the exalted and true King, in order to show the greatness of his powers and the treasures of his divinity, had prepared the great banquet of his creation, and having spread the liberal repast for all the creatures, invited the guests, that is the human race, by the creation of its first parents. Vashti, our mother Eve, disobeyed, failing to submit herself to the divine command, and now amid the wonderful acclamation and jubilee of the angels, the true Assuerus ordered the most humble Esther to be on that day elevated to sovereignty over all creation, this Esther being none other than the most holy Mary, full of grace and beauty, chosen among all the daughters of men as their restoratrix and the mother of Christ. In the plenitude of this mystery, the Most High infused into the heart of our Queen a new abhorrence of the demon, such as filled Esther toward Aman. Esther 7:10. And thus it happened, that she thrust him from his position of superiority and command over the world. She crushed the head of his pride, hanging him on the gallows of the cross, where he had hoped to destroy and conquer the God-man, but was himself chastened and overcome by it. Toward all this, the most holy Mary was instrumental, as we shall relate in its place. Just as the envy of the dragon against the woman, that is this heavenly Lady, commenced in heaven, when he saw her clothed with the sun. Apocalypse 12:4. So this strife continued until he was deprived of his tyrannous dominion. Just as the most faithful Mardocheus was given the position of the proud Aman. Esther 6:10. So also was honored the most chaste and faithful Joseph, who continually urged her to pray for the liberty of her people. This was the constant subject of conversation between Joseph and his most pure spouse. For this very purpose was he raised to the summit of sanctity and to the exalted dignity of holding the sealing ring of the highest King. Esther 8:2. Whereby he received authority to command the God-man himself, as is related in the Gospel. Having experienced all these mysteries, our Queen issued from her vision. Instruction which the heavenly Queen gave me. Wonderful, my daughter, was the gift of humility, which the Most High conferred upon me in the event described by thee. And since his Majesty does not reject the prayers of those that dispose themselves to receive it, I desire that thou imitate me and be my companion in the exercise of this virtue. I had no part in the sin of Adam, for I was exempted from his disobedience. But because I partook of his nature and by it was his daughter, I humiliated myself in my estimation to nothingness. In the light of this example, then, how far must those humiliate themselves, who not only have had a part in the first sin, but also have committed other sins without number? The aim and motive of this humiliation, moreover, should not be to remove the punishment of those sins, but to make restoration and recompense for the diminution and loss of honor, which was thereby occasioned to the Creator and Lord. If a brother of thine should grievously offend thy natural father, thou wouldst not be a loving and loyal daughter of thy father, nor a true sister to thy brother, if thou wouldst not grieve for the offense and weep not over his ruin as over thy own. For to the father is due reverence, and to thy brother thou owest love as to thyself. Consider then, dearest, and examine in the proper light how much difference there is between thy Father, who is in heaven, and thy natural father, and how all of you are his children, bound together by the strictest obligation of brethren and of servants of one true Master. Just as thou wouldst shed tears of humiliation and confusion at some ignominious fault of thy natural brother, so I wish that thou do it for the sins, which the mortals commit against God, sorrowing for them in confusion as if thou wert responsible for them thyself. That is what I did at the thought of the disobedience of Adam and Eve and of all the evils, which ensued therefrom to the human race. And the Most High was pleased with my charitable interest, for most agreeable in his sight are the tears shed for the sins, which are forgotten by those that have committed them. At the same time, see thou bear ever in mind that, no matter how great and rare are the favors received from the Most High, thou do not despise the danger of sin, nor contemn the solicitous and humble performance of the ordinary duties of precept and charity. For these do not oblige thee to leave the presence of God. Faith teaches thee, and inspiration should govern thee, to bear him with thee in all occupations and places, quitting thyself and thy inclinations, but fulfilling in all things the will of thy Lord and Spouse. Do not allow thyself to be led in these sentiments by the trend of thy own inclinations, nor by that which seems to agree with thy own interior liking and taste, for many times the greatest danger is hidden beneath this cloak. In such doubts and hesitations, let holy obedience be thy umpire and master. Through it thou canst decide securely, and thou wilt need no other criterion for thy actions. Great victories and advances in merit are connected with the true submission of self and subjection of our own judgments to those of others. Thou shouldest never wish to retain for thyself the power to will or not to will, then thou shalt sing of victories and overcome thy enemies. End of chapter 6. Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 7. The Most High celebrates a new espousal with the Princess of Heaven. In order to inaugurate the nuptials of the Incarnation, he adorns her for it. Great are the works of the Most High, for all of them were and are executed with the plenitude of knowledge and goodness, ordained in equity and number. Wisdom, chapter 11, verse 21. None of them is faulty, useless or ineffectual, superfluous or vain. All are exquisite and magnificent, finished and executed according to the full measure of his holy will. Such he desired them to be, in order that he might be known and magnified in them. But in comparison to the mystery of the Incarnation, all the works of God ad extra, although they are in themselves great, stupendous and marvelous, more to be admired than comprehended, are only a small spark, issuing from the unfathomable abyss of the Divinity. This great sacrament of vesting himself in a passible and mortal nature is preeminently the great work of his infinite power and wisdom, and the one which immeasurably excels all the other works and wonders of his powerful arm. For in this mystery, not merely a spark of the Divinity, but that whole vast volcano of the infinite Godhead broke forth and communicated itself to men, uniting itself by an indissoluble and eternal union to our terrestrial human nature. If this wonderful sacrament of the King is to be measured only by his own vastness, it follows that the woman, in whose womb he was to become man, deserved to be so perfectly adorned with the plenitude of his treasures, that no gift or grace within the range of possibility be omitted, and all these gifts be so consummate that nothing is wanting to them. As all this was reasonable and altogether befitting the greatness of the Omnipotent, he certainly fulfilled it in the most holy Mary, much better than King Ahasuerus did with the gracious Esther. Esther 2:9. When he raised her to his magnificent throne. The Most High visited our Queen Mary with such great favors, privileges and gifts, that the like was never even conceived in the minds of creatures. And when she issued forth in the presence of the courtiers of this great King of the eternal ages. First letter to Saint Timothy, 1:17. They recognized and exalted in her the power of God, at the same time understanding that he, who chose to select a woman for his mother, knew also how to make her worthy of assuming that position. The seventh day of this mysterious preparation for the approaching sacrament arrived, and in the same hour as already mentioned, the heavenly Lady was called and elevated in spirit, but with this difference, that she was bodily raised by her holy angels to the empyrean heaven, while in her stead one of them remained to represent her in corporeal appearance. Placed into this highest heaven, she saw the Divinity by abstract vision as in other days, but always with new and more penetrating light, piercing to new and more profound mysteries, which God according to his free will can conceal or reveal. Presently she heard a voice proceeding from the royal throne, which said, "Our spouse and chosen dove, our gracious friend, who has been found pleasing in our eyes, and hast been chosen among thousands, we wish to accept thee anew as our bride, and therefore we wish to adorn and beautify thee in a manner worthy of our design." On hearing these words, the most humble among the humble abased and annihilated herself in the presence of the Most High more than can be comprehended by human power. Entirely submissive to the divine pleasure, and with entrancing modesty, she responded: "At thy feet, O Lord, lies the dust and abject worm. Ready is thy poor slave for the fulfillment of all thy pleasure in her. Make use, O eternal Good, of this thy insignificant instrument, according to thy desire, and dispose of it with thy right hand." Presently the Most High commanded two seraphim, of those nearest to his throne and highest in dignity, to attend on this heavenly Virgin. Accompanied by others, they presented themselves in visible form before the throne, and there surrounded the most holy Mary, who was more inflamed with divine love than they. It was a spectacle worthy of new wonder and jubilee for all the angelic spirits to see in this heavenly place, never touched by other feet, a humble maiden consecrated as their Queen and raised to the closest proximity to God of all the created beings, to see that woman, whom the world ignored and held in oblivious contempt, so highly esteemed and appreciated. Proverbs 31:10. To see our human nature in its first fruits, receiving the pledge of superiority over the celestial choirs, and already assuming its place among them. Oh, what a holy and just envy must such a strange wonder have caused in the ancient courtiers of that heavenly Jerusalem! What thoughts rose up within them in praise of its author? What sentiments of humility did it awaken in them, subjecting all their high understandings to the decrees of the divine will? They saw that he was holy and just, who exalted the humble, who favored human lowliness and raised it above the angelic choirs. While the inhabitants of heaven were lost in their praiseworthy admiration, the most blessed Trinity, according to our imperfect mode of understanding and speaking, conferred within itself. How pleasing in its sight was the Princess Mary, how perfectly and completely she had corresponded with the blessings and gifts confided to her, how adequately she had augmented the glory of the Lord, and how free she was of any fault, defect, or hindrance that might compromise the dignity of her predestined motherhood of the Word. Accordingly, the three persons of the Trinity resolved to raise this creature to the highest position of grace and friendship of God, such as no creature had ever or would ever attain. And then and there they gave to her more than to all the rest of the creatures together. The most blessed Trinity was pleased and rejoiced in seeing that the supreme holiness of Mary was such as had been conceived and determined for her in the divine intellect. In correspondence with this holiness, and as a completion of it, and as a testimony of the benevolence with which the Lord wished to communicate to her ever new influences of his divinity, he ordained and commanded that most holy Mary be visibly clothed and adorned with mysterious vestments and jewels, which should symbolize the interior graces and privileges of a queen and of a heavenly spouse. Although such bridal adornments had already been conferred upon her before that time, when she was presented in the temple. Yet now this was done under new and wonderful conditions, for it was to serve as the immediate preparation for the miracle of the Incarnation. Presently, therefore, upon the command of the Lord, the two seraphim clothed most holy Mary with a tunic or ample robe, which, as a symbol of her purity and grace, was so exquisitely white and resplendent, that if one single ray of the light so profusely emanated by it would flash into the world, it would by itself give more refulgence than all the stars combined, even if they were all suns. And in comparison with it, all the light, which is known to us, would appear as darkness. While the seraphim vested her, the Most High gave her a profound understanding of the obligation entailed thereby, namely, that she must make a befitting return to his Majesty by proportioning her faithful love and the exalted perfection of her actions to that which she had now learnt. Nevertheless, the purpose for which the Lord intended these blessings, that is his incarnation through her, continued to be hidden to her mind. All the rest of the mysteries our Lady understood, and for all of them she humiliated herself with ineffable prudence, and she asked the divine assistance for corresponding to these favors and blessings. Over this robe the same seraphim placed a girdle, as a symbol of the holy fear, which was infused into her. It was very rich, with jewels of extreme refulgence and beauty. At the same time the fountain of light, bursting forth from the divinity, enlightened and illumined the heavenly Princess, so that she understood the exalted reasons why God should be feared by all the creatures. With this gift of fear of the Lord, she was appropriately girded, as befitted a creature, who was to treat and converse so familiarly with her Creator as his mother. Presently she perceived that the seraphim adorned her with most beautiful and abundant hair, held together by a rich clasp, more brilliant than pure and polished gold. She understood that in this embellishment was conceded to her the privilege of spending her whole life in exalted and divine thoughts, inflamed by the subtlest charity as signified by the gold. In connection with this privilege, she was established anew in the habits of unclouded wisdom and science, exquisitely binding up the hair of exalted thoughts by an ineffable participation in the wisdom and science of God himself. Sandals or shoes were also given to her to indicate that all her steps and movements would be most beauteous. Canticles 7:1. Tending always to the high and holy aim of the greater glory of the Most High. And these shoes were laced with the especial grace of anxious diligence in doing good both before God and man. Luke 1:39. as it happened when she hastened to visit Saint Elizabeth and Saint John. And thus this daughter of the Prince issued most beautiful in her footsteps. Canticles chapter 7 verse 1. Her arms were adorned with bracelets, filling her with magnanimity for undertaking great works in participation of the divine magnificence, and thus she always extended them toward courageous deeds. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 19. Her fingers were embellished by rings, in order that in smaller and more inferior matters she might act in a superior manner, exalted in aim and purpose, and in all respect making her doings grand and admirable. To this they added a necklace, set with inestimable and brilliant jewels, and containing symbols of the most three excellent virtues of faith, hope, and charity, in correspondence with the three divine persons. Conjointly with these gifts, they renewed in her the habits of these most noble virtues, which she would especially need in the mysteries of the Incarnation and Redemption. In her ears they hung earrings of gold, filigreed with silver. Canticles chapter 1 verse 10. Thus preparing her ears for the message, which she was shortly to hear from the Archangel Gabriel, and at the same time they furnished her with knowledge in order that she might listen attentively and give discreet and acceptable answers to the divine proposals. Thus would pure silver of her innocence resound in the ears of the Lord and re-echo in the bosom of the Divinity those charming and sacred words: Fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum. Be it done to me according to thy word. Luke chapter 1 verse 38. Then they spread over her garments inscriptions, which at the same time served as embroidery or borders of the finest colors mixed with gold. Some of them bore the legend, Mary, Mother of God; others, Mary, Virgin and Mother. But these inscriptions were not intelligible to her, nor were they explained to her, but their meaning was known to the holy angels. The different colors symbolized the habits of all the virtues in the most excellent degree, and their active exercise, surpassing all that was ever practiced by the rest of the intellectual creatures. And as a complement of all this beauty, they furnished her as if with lotions for her face, by illuminating her with the light drawn from the proximity and participation of the inexhaustible being and perfection of God himself. For as she was destined actually and truly to shelter within her virginal womb the infinite perfection of God, it was befitting that she should have received it beforehand by grace in the highest measure possible to a mere creature. In this adornment and beauty, our Princess Mary stood before the Lord so beautiful and charming that even the Supreme King could desire her as spouse. Psalm 44 verse 12. I do not detain myself here in repeating what I have already said, what I will yet say in this history about her virtues. I only say that this adornment was accompanied by new features and effects altogether divine. All this was proper to the infinite power and to its immense perfection and sanctity, which offered to our comprehension ever new fields of speculation. And when there is question of this ocean of perfection in most holy Mary, we certainly can hope only to skirt its shores. My understanding of that which I perceive is always pregnant with vast fields of thought, of which I cannot expatiate. Instruction which the most holy Queen Mary gave me. My daughter, the workshops and treasure rooms of the Most High are those of a divine Lord and omnipotent King, and therefore without number or limit are the riches and treasures which they contain for the endowment of his chosen brides. He can enrich innumerable others, just as he has enriched my soul, and yet infinitely more will remain. Although he will give to no creature as much as he has conferred upon me, it is not because he is not able or does not wish, but because no one will dispose himself for his graces as I did. But the Almighty is most liberal with some souls and enriches them so munificently, because they impede his gifts less and dispose themselves better than others. I desire, my most beloved, that thou place no obstacle to the love of thy Lord, but I wish that thou dispose thyself for the jewels and gifts intended for thee in order to make thee worthy of his bridal chamber. Remember that all the just souls receive this adornment from his hands, though each one according to the degree of the friendship and grace which makes them capable of receiving them. If thou wishest to attain the highest purity of that perfection and become worthy of standing in the presence of thy Lord and Spouse, strive to be robust and strong in love, and thou knowest that this is augmented in the same degree as mortification and self-abnegation are practiced. Thou must deny thyself and forget all earthly things. Thou must expel all thy meanings toward thyself and toward visible things. In the divine love solely thou must increase and advance. Wash and purify thyself in the blood of thy Redeemer, Christ, and apply this cleansing many times by renewing thy loving sorrow for thy sins. Thereby wilt thou find grace in his eyes, and thy beauty will be desired by him, and all thy adornments will be full of the greatest perfection and purity. And as thou hast been so highly favored and distinguished by the blessings of the Lord, it is just that thou, more than many generations of men, give thanks and with incessant praises magnify him for what he has condescended to do for thee. If this vice of ingratitude is so vile and reprehensible in the creatures, who owe him little and in their earthliness and coarseness forget the benefits of the Lord, greater will thy guilt be in falling short of thy obligations. And do not deceive thyself with the pretext of being humble, for there is a great difference between thankful humility and humble thanklessness. Remember that the Lord very often shows great favors to the unworthy in order to manifest his goodness and munificence. On the contrary, let no one become inflated, but let everyone acknowledge so much the more his unworthiness, using it as a medicine and treacle against the poison of presumption. But gratitude will agree with this humble opinion of self, since we must acknowledge that every good gift comes from the Father of lights and cannot ever be merited by creatures. Letter of St. James, chapter 1, verse 17. All have their source only in his goodness, binding us and obliging us to grateful recognition. End of chapter 7. Book 1, Chapter 8 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 8. Our Great Queen, in the presence of the Lord, pleads for the hastening of the Incarnation and of the redemption of man, and His Majesty yields to her prayer. The heavenly Princess, most holy Mary, had now attained such fullness of grace and beauty, and the heart of God was so wounded by her tender affections and desires. Canticles chapter 4, verse 9. That he was, so to say, irresistibly drawn to begin his flight from the bosom of the Eternal Father to the bridal chamber of her virginal womb, and end the long delay of more than 5,000 years. Nevertheless, since this new wonder was to be executed in the plenitude of his wisdom and equity, the Lord arranged this event in such a way, that the Princess of the heavens herself, being the worthy mother of the incarnate Word, should at the same time be also the most powerful mediatrix of his coming and the Redeemer of his people, much more than Esther was of Israel. Esther chapters 7 and 8. In the heart of most holy Mary burned the flame, which God himself had enkindled, and without intermission she prayed for the salvation of the human race. However, as yet the most humble Lady restrained herself in modesty, knowing that on account of the sin of Adam, the sentence of death and of eternal privation from the vision of God had been promulgated. Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. A heavenly strife thus arose in the most pure heart of Mary between her love and her humility, and, lost in these sentiments, she repeated many times: "O who shall be able to secure the salvation of my brethren? O who shall be able to draw from the bosom of the Eternal Father his only begotten, and make him a partaker of our mortality? Who shall oblige him to give to our human nature the kiss of his mouth, for which the bride asks him?" Canticles chapter 1, verse 1. But how can we, the children and descendants of the malefactor who committed the crime, ask for this favor? How can we draw him toward us, whom our fathers repelled? O my love, if I could but see thee at the breasts of thy mother, the human nature. Canticles, chapter 8, verse 1. O light of lights, God of the true God, would that thou descend, bending down thy heavens. Psalm 143, verse 5. And shedding thy light upon those that live sitting in darkness. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. Would that thou pacify thy Father, and by thy right hand, that is by his only begotten, hurl the proud Ammon, thy enemy, the devil, from his height. Who shall be the mediatrix? Who shall draw from the celestial altar, as with tongs of gold? Isaiah chapter 6, verse 6. That ember of the divinity, for the purification of the world, as once did the seraphim, according to the word of the prophet Isaias. This prayer most holy Mary repeated during the 8th day of her preparation, and at midnight, being wrapped and entranced in the Lord, she heard his Majesty responding to her. My spouse and my dove, come, my chosen one, for the common law does not apply to thee. Esther chapter 15, verse 13. Thou art exempt from sin, and thou art free from its effects since the moment of thy conception. When I gave being to thee, I turned away from thee the scepter of my justice, and laid upon thy neck that of my great clemency, in order that the general edict of sin might not touch thee. Come to me, and be not dismayed in the consciousness of thy human nature. I am he who raises the humble, and fills with riches those that are poor. Thou hast me for thy friend, and my liberal mercies shall be at thy disposal. These words our Queen heard intellectually, and, as in the preceding night, she presently felt herself raised by the holy angels bodily to heaven, while in her stead remained one of the angels of her guard. Again she ascended to the presence of the Most High, so enriched by the treasures of his graces and gifts, so fortunate and beautiful, that she singularly excited the wonder of the supernal spirits. They broke out in praise of the Almighty, saying, Who is this that ascends from the desert, overflowing with delights? Canticles chapter 8, verse 5. Who is she that so attracts and compels her beloved as to bear him with her to the earthly habitation? Who is she that rises as the dawn, more beautiful than the moon, chosen as the sun? Canticles chapter 6, verse 9. How refulgent doth she rise from the darkness of the earth? How is she so courageous and strong, being clothed in such fragile nature? How does she in her strength overcome the Almighty? And how comes it that the heavens, which are closed against the children of Adam, are thus thrown open to this singular woman, sprung from the same race? The Most High received his holy and chosen bride, most holy Mary, into his presence. Although this happened not in an intuitive, but in an abstractive vision of the divinity, it was accompanied by incomparable favors of light and purification proceeding from the Lord himself, such as were specifically reserved for this day. For they were so divine that, in our way of speaking, God himself who wrought them was astonished and was charmed with the work of his hand. As if entranced with love, he spoke to her and said, Revertire, revertire, Sulamitis, ut intuemur te. Return, return, O Sulamitis, that we may behold thee. My spouse, my most perfect and beloved dove, pleasing in my sight, turn and advance toward us, that we may behold thee and be charmed by thy beauty. I do not regret to have created man, and I delight in his formation, since thou hast been born of him. Let my celestial spirits see how justly I have desired and do desire to choose thee as my spouse and the queen of all the creatures. Let them see what reason I have to rejoice in this, my bridal chamber, from whence my only begotten, next to that of my own bosom, shall derive the greatest glory. Let all understand, that if I justly repudiated Eve, the first queen of the earth, on account of her disobedience, I now place thee and establish thee in the highest dignity, showing my magnificence and power in dealing with thy purest humility and self-abasement. This day was for the angels a day of jubilation and rejoicing greater than any since their creation. And when this most blessed Trinity thus chose and appointed his spouse and mother of the Word for the Queen and Lady of the creatures, the holy angels and all the celestial court of spirits acknowledged and received her as their mistress and superior, and they sung sweet hymns of glory in her honor and in praise of her author. During these hidden and admirable mysteries, the heavenly Queen Mary was absorbed in the abyss of the Divinity and in the light of his infinite perfections, and thereby the Lord prevented her from attending to all that happened. Thus the sacrament of her mothership of the Only-Begotten still remained hidden to her until the proper time. Never did the Lord deal in such a manner with any nation. Psalm 147, verse 20. Nor did he ever show himself so great and powerful in any creature as on this day in most holy Mary. The Most High added yet other favors, saying to her with extreme condescension: My chosen spouse, since thou hast found grace in my eyes, ask of me without restraint what thou desirest, and I assure thee, as the most faithful God and powerful King, that I shall not reject thy petitions, nor deny thee what thou askest. Our great Princess humiliated herself profoundly, and relying on the promise and royal word of the Lord, and inspired with highest confidence, she answered, saying: My Lord and highest God, if I have found grace in thy eyes. Genesis 18, verses 3 and 27. Although I am dust and ashes, I will speak in thy divine presence and pour out to thee my heart. Psalm 61, verse 9. Again his Majesty assured her and commanded her to ask in the presence of all the heavenly court for whatever she desired, even if it were a part of his kingdom. Esther 5, verse 3. I do not ask, O Lord, for a part of thy kingdom in my own behalf, answered most holy Mary, but I ask for the whole of it for all the race of men who are my brothers. I beseech thee, highest and powerful King, that according to thy immense kindness, thou sentest thy Only-Begotten, our Redeemer, in order that he may satisfy for the sins of all the world, that thy people may gain the freedom so much desired, and that, through the satisfaction thus rendered to thy justice, peace may be declared among men upon earth. Ezekiel 34, verse 25. And that the portals of heaven, closed by sin, may be thrown open for its inhabitants. Let all flesh see thy salvation. Isaiah 52, verse 10. Let peace and justice give each other that close embrace and the kiss which David asked for. Psalm 84, verse 11. Let us mortals possess a teacher, a guide and a savior. Isaiah 30, verse 20. A chief who shall live and dwell with us. Baruch 3, verse 38. Let the day of thy promises dawn upon us, O my God. Let thy words be fulfilled, and let the Messias, expected for so many ages, arrive. These are my anxious desires, and for this do I breathe forth my sighs, since thou showest to me the condescension of thy infinite clemency. The highest Lord, who wished to bind himself by her prayer, disposed and incited the petitions of his beloved spouse. Benignly he inclined toward her and answered her with singular clemency. Pleasing to my will are thy requests, and acceptable are thy petitions. It shall be done as thou askest. I desire, my daughter and spouse, what thou seekest, and as a pledge of this, I give thee my word and promise thee that very shortly my Only-Begotten shall descend to the earth and shall vest himself and unite himself with the human nature. Thus thy acceptable wishes shall be executed and fulfilled. With this assurance and divine promise, our great Queen Princess felt new enlightenment and security in her spirit, convincing her that the end of that long protracted and prolix night of sin and of the ancient law was approaching, and that the brightness of human redemption was about to dawn. And because the rays of the Sun of Justice, whose dawn was soon to arise from her, so closely and so intensely enveloped her about, she became herself the most beautiful aurora, inflamed and refulgent as it were with the fiery clouds of the Divinity, which transformed all things within her. All afire with love and gratitude for the approaching redemption, she gave unceasing praise to the Lord, both in her own name and in that of all the mortals. In this occupation she passed that day, after the angels had again restored her to earth. I must grieve at my ignorance and shortcomings in explaining these so exalted mysteries, and if learned men and great students cannot give an adequate explanation of these things, how shall it be given by a poor and lowly woman? May my ignorance be supplemented by the light of Christian charity, and my presumption be atoned for by my obedience. Instruction which most holy Mary the Queen gave me. My dearest daughter, how far removed is earthly wisdom from the admirable operations of the divine power in these sacraments of the incarnation of the divine Word in my womb. Flesh and blood cannot reach them, and not the angels and seraphim, though they be the highest. Nor can they know mysteries so deeply hidden and so far above the ordinary course of grace. Praise thou, my beloved, the Lord for them with incessant love and thankfulness. Be thou not longer slow in understanding the greatness of his divine love and his readiness to benefit his friends and dear ones, whom he desires to elevate from the dust and enrich in diverse manners. As soon as thou hast penetrated into this truth, it will oblige thee to thank him and incite thee to undertake the great things that become a most faithful daughter and spouse. And in order that thou mayest dispose thyself and be inspired so much the more, I remind thee that the Lord often says these same words to his chosen ones. Revertere ut intueamur te. For he derives just as great pleasure from their deeds, as when a father rejoices in his beloved and well-behaved son, whom he looks upon many times with great affection, or as an artist when he beholds with pride the perfect works of his hands, or as a king who inspects the rich city, which he has added to his dominions, or as one who is pleased with his much beloved friend. There is only this difference. The Most High finds incomparably more delight than all these in the souls, which he has chosen for his blessings, and in proportion as they dispose themselves and advance in virtue, the Lord also multiplies his favors and benefits. If the mortals that attain to the light of faith would enter into this truth, they would, merely on account of this complacence of the Almighty in their good deeds, not only preserve themselves from sin, but they would zealously engage in great works until death, and eagerly show their loving servitude to him, who is so liberal in rewarding and so generous in his favors. When on this 8th day, which thou hast described, the Lord in heaven spoke to me these words, Revertere, asking me to turn toward him and allow the celestial spirits to look upon me, I was made aware that the pleasure, which his divine Majesty derived in beholding me, by itself exceeded all the delight and complacency, which he ever derived from all the most saintly souls in the height of their sanctity. In his gracious condescension, he was more pleased in me than in all the apostles, martyrs, confessors, virgins, and all the rest of the saints. And this pleasure and complacency of the Most High overflowed and enriched my spirit with such an influx of grace and participation of the divinity, that thou canst neither understand nor explain it as long as thou art in the mortal flesh. But I tell thee of this hidden mystery, in order that thou mayest bless its author, and that, while yet thy exile from the fatherland continues, thou dispose and exert thyself in my place and name to extend and reach out thy hands to great things. Proverbs 31:19. Give to the Lord the satisfaction expected of thee, and strive after it, thus earning his blessings and soliciting them for thyself and thy neighbor with perfect charity. End of chapter 8. Book 1, Chapter 9 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 9. The Most High renews all his favors and benefits in the Most Holy Mary, and, as the ultimate preparation for the Incarnation, makes her sovereign and queen of all the universe. On the last day of the novena of immediate preparation of the tabernacle, Psalm 45, verse 5, which he was to sanctify by his coming, the Most High resolved to renew his wonders and multiply his tokens of love, repeating the favors and benefits which up to this day he had conferred upon the Princess Mary. But the Almighty chose to work in such a way that in drawing forth from his infinite treasures his gifts of old, he always added thereto such as were new. All of these different kinds of wonders were appropriate to the end he had in view, lowering his divinity to the human nature and raising a woman to the dignity of Mother of God. In descending to the lowliness of man's estate, God neither could nor needed to change his essence, for remaining immutable in himself, he could unite his person to our nature. But an earthly woman, in ascending to such an excellence that God should unite with her and become man of her substance, apparently must traverse an infinite space and be raised so far above other creatures as to approach God's infinite being itself. The day had then arrived in which most holy Mary was to reach the last stage and be placed so close to God as to become his mother. In that night, at the hour of greatest silence, she was again called by the same Lord as it had happened on other days. The humble and prudent Queen responded, "My heart is prepared." Psalm 107, verse 2. My Lord and exalted Sovereign, let thy divine pleasure be fulfilled in me. Immediately she was, as on the preceding day, borne body and soul by the hands of her angels to the Empyrean and placed in the presence of the royal throne of the Most High. And his divine Majesty raised her up and seated her at his side, assigning to her the position and throne, which she was to occupy forever in his presence. Next to the one reserved for the incarnate Word, it was the highest and the most approximate to God himself, for it excelled incomparably that of any of the other blessed, and that of all of them together. From this position she saw the divinity by an abstractive vision, as at other times, and his Majesty, hiding from her the dignity of Mother of God, manifested to her such unusual and such high sacraments, that on account of their sublimity and my insignificant capacities, I cannot describe them. Again she saw in the divinity all things created, and many other possible and future ones. The corporeal things God manifested and made known to her by corporeal and sensible images, as if they had been presented to her ocular vision. The fabric of the universe, which before this she had known in parts, now appeared to her in its entirety, distinctly pictured as upon canvas, with all the creatures contained therein. She saw the harmony, order, connection and dependence of each toward each, and of the divine will, which had created them, governs and preserves them, each in its place and mode of existence. Again she saw all the heavens and the stars, the elements and those that lived in them, purgatory, limbo, hell, and all the occupants of these caverns. Just as the position of the Queen of creation was above all creatures and inferior only to that of God, so also the knowledge given to her was superior to that of all created things, being inferior only to that of the Lord. While thus the heavenly Lady was lost in admiration of what the Almighty showed to her, and was wrapped in praise and exaltation of the Lord, his Majesty spoke to her and said, "My chosen dove, all the visible creatures, which thou beholdest, I have created and preserved in all their variety and beauty by my providence, solely for the love of men. And from all the souls, which I have until now created, and which are predestined to be created until the end, I shall choose and select the congregation of the faithful, who shall be set apart and washed in the blood of the Lamb in the redemption of the world. They shall be the special fruit of his redemption, and they shall enjoy its blessings through the new law of grace and the sacraments to be instituted by the Redeemer. And afterwards, those that persevere shall partake of my eternal glory and friendship. For these chosen ones I have primarily created these wonderful works, and if all of them would strive to serve me, adore and acknowledge my holy name, as far as I am concerned, I would for each and every one of them create these great treasures and assign all over to them as their possession. And if I had created only one being capable of my grace and glory, I would have made it the Lord and Master of all creation, for this would be a much smaller favor than to make it partaker of my friendship and of eternal happiness. Thou, my spouse, shalt be my chosen one, and thou hast found grace in my sight, and therefore I make thee mistress of all these goods, and I give thee dominion and possession of them all, so that, if thou art a faithful spouse according to my wishes, thou mayest distribute and dispose of them according as thou desirest and according as thy intercession shall direct. For this is the purpose for which they are given into thy possession." Therewith the most blessed Trinity placed a crown on the head of our Princess Mary, consecrating her as the sovereign Queen of all creation. Upon it was spread and enameled the inscription, "Mother of God." But its meaning was not known to her at this time. The heavenly spirits, however, knew it, and they were filled with admiration at the magnificence of the Lord toward this maiden, most fortunate and blessed among womankind. They revered and honored her as their legitimate queen and as sovereign of all creation. All these portents of love the right hand of the Most High wrought according to the order most befitting his infinite wisdom. For before coming down to assume flesh in the virginal womb of this Lady, it was proper that all his courtiers should acknowledge his mother as their queen and mistress, and give her due honor as such. It was certainly proper and just that God should first make her queen before making her mother of the Prince of eternities, for she that was to bear a prince must necessarily first be a queen, and be acknowledged as queen by her vassals. That the angels should know her as mother was not improper, nor was there any necessity of concealing it from them. But on the other hand, it seemed due to the majesty of the Divinity that the tabernacle chosen for his indwelling should appear before them prepared and adorned with all that was highest in dignity and perfection, in nobility and magnificence to the highest extent in which it was possible. Thus then was she presented to the holy angels and recognized by them as their honored Queen and Lady. In order to put the last touch to this prodigious work of preparing the most holy Mary, the Lord extended his powerful arm and expressly renewed the spirit and the faculties of the great Lady, giving her new inclinations, habits and qualities, the greatness and excellence of which are inexpressible in terrestrial terms. It was the finishing act and the final retouching of the living image of God, in order to form, in it and of it, the very shape into which the eternal Word, the essential image of the eternal Father. Second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4:4. And the figure of his substance. Hebrews chapter 1:3. Was to be cast. Thus the whole temple of most holy Mary, more so than that of Solomon, was covered with the purest gold of the Divinity inside and out. Third Book of Kings, chapter 6:30. So that nowhere could be seen in her any grossness of an earthly daughter of Adam. Her entire being was made to shine forth the Divinity, for since the divine Word was to issue from the bosom of the eternal Father to descend to that of Mary, he provided for the greatest possible similarity between the Mother and the Father. No words at my disposal could ever suffice to describe as I would wish the effects of these favors in the heart of our great Queen and Mistress. Human thought cannot conceive them. How then can human words express them? But what has caused the greatest wonder in me, when I considered these things in the light given to me, is the humility of this heavenly woman and the mutual contest between her humility and the divine power. Rare and astonishing prodigy of humility to see this maiden, most holy Mary, though raised to the supremest dignity and holiness next to God, yet humiliating herself and debasing herself below the meanest of the creatures, so that by the force of this humility no thought of her being destined for the mothership of the Messias could enter into her mind. And not only this, she did not even have a suspicion of anything great or admirable in herself. Psalm 130:1. Her eyes and heart were not elated. On the contrary, the higher she ascended by the operation of the right hand of her God, so much the more lowly were her thoughts concerning herself. It was therefore just that the Almighty should look upon her humility. Luke chapter 1:48. And that therefore all generations should call her fortunate and blessed. Instruction which the Queen and Mistress of Heaven gave me. My daughter, the soul that has only a selfish and servile love is not a worthy spouse of the Most High, for she must not love or fear like a slave, nor is she supposed to serve for her daily wages. Yet although her heart must be a filial and generous love on account of the excellence and immense goodness of her spouse, she must nevertheless also feel herself much bounden to him when she considers how rich and liberal he is, how, on account of his love for souls, he has created such a variety of visible goods in order that they might serve those who serve him, and especially when she considers how many hidden treasures he has in readiness in the abundance of his sweetness. Psalm 30:20. For those that fear him as his true children. I wish that thou feel deeply obliged to thy Lord and Father, thy spouse and friend, at the thought of the riches given to those souls who become his dearest children. For as a powerful Father, he holds in readiness these great and manifold gifts for his children, and if necessary, all of his gifts for each one of them in particular. In the midst of such motives and incentives of love, the disaffection of men is inexcusable, and at the sight of so many blessings, given without measure, their ingratitude is unpardonable. Remember also, my dearest, that thou wast no foreigner or stranger in this house of the Lord, his holy church. Ephesians 2:19. But thou wast made a domestic and a spouse of Christ among the saints, favored by his gifts and by the dowry of a bride. Since all the treasures and riches of the bridegroom belong to the legitimate spouse, consider of how great possessions he makes thee participant and mistress. Enjoy them, then, as his domestic, and be zealous for his honor as a much favored daughter and spouse. Thank him for all these works and benefits, as if they had all been prepared for thee alone by the Lord. Love and reverence him for thyself, and for all thy neighbors, to whom God has been so liberal. In this imitate, with thy weak faculties, that which thou hast understood of what I have done. I assure thee also, daughter, that it will be very pleasing to me, if thou magnify and praise the Omnipotent with fervent affection, for the favors and riches which, beyond all human conception, the divine right hand showered upon me. End of chapter 9. Book 1, Chapter 10 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 10. The Blessed Trinity sends the Archangel Gabriel as a messenger to announce to Most Holy Mary that she is chosen as the Mother of God. For infinite ages had been appointed the convenient hour and time in which the great mystery of piety, First Letter to Saint Timothy, chapter 3:16, which was approved by the Spirit, prophesied to men, foretold to the angels, and expected in the world, was to be drawn from the hidden recesses of the divine wisdom in order to be appropriately manifested in the flesh. The plenitude of time, Galatians chapter 4:4, had arrived, that time which until then, although filled with prophecies and promises, was nevertheless void and empty, for it was wanted the fullness of the Most Holy Mary, by whose will and consent all the ages were to receive their complement, namely the eternal Word made flesh, capable of suffering and redeeming man. Before all ages this mystery was prearranged in such a way that it should be fulfilled through the mediation of this heavenly Maiden. Since now she existed in the world, the redemption of man and the coming of the only begotten of the Father was no longer to be delayed. For now he would not need to come and live as if by sufferance merely intense. Second Book of Kings, chapter 7:6, or in a strange house. But he could enjoy a free welcome as in his temple and as in his own house, one that had been built and enriched at his own preordained expense, more so than the temple of Solomon at the expense of his father David. First Paralipomena, chapter 22:5. In this predetermined time, then the Most High resolved to send his only begotten Son into the world, and comparing, according to our way of understanding and speaking, the decrees of his eternity with the prophecies and testimonies made to man from the beginning of the world, and all this together with the position of sanctity to which he had raised most holy Mary, he judged that all the circumstances were favorable for the exaltation of his holy name, and that the execution of his eternal will and decree should be made manifest to the angels and be commenced by them. His Majesty spoke to the Archangel Gabriel in such words or language as he was accustomed to use in intimating his will to the holy angels. Although God usually illumines the holy spirits by commencing with the higher angels, who in turn purify and illumine the others in their order down to the least among them, thus making known the revelations of the Divinity. Yet on this occasion this usage was not maintained, for the holy Archangel received his message immediately from the mouth of God. At the bidding of the divine will, the holy Gabriel presented himself at the foot of the throne, intent upon the immutable essence of the Most High. His Majesty then expressly charged him with the message, which he was to bring to the most holy Mary, and instructed him in the very words with which he was to salute and address her. Thus the first author of the message was God himself, who formed the exact words in his divine mind and revealed them to the holy Archangel for transmission to the most pure Mary. At the same time the Lord revealed to the holy Prince Gabriel many hidden sacraments concerning the Incarnation. The Blessed Trinity commanded him to betake himself to the heavenly Maiden and announce to her that the Lord had chosen her among women to be the mother of the eternal Word, that she should conceive him in her virginal womb through operation of the Holy Ghost, without injury to her virginity. In this and in all the rest of the message, which he was to declare and manifest to this great Queen and Mistress, the Archangel was instructed by the Blessed Trinity itself. Thereupon his Majesty announced to all the other angels that the time of the redemption had come, and that he had commanded it to be brought to the world without delay. For already in their presence the most holy Mary had been prepared and adorned to be his mother, and had been exalted to the supreme dignity. The heavenly spirits heard the voice of their Creator, and with incomparable joy and thanksgiving for the fulfillment of his eternal and perfect will, they intoned new canticles of praise, repeating therein that hymn of Sion: Holy, holy, holy art thou, God and Lord Sabaoth. Isaiah 6:3. Just and powerful art thou, Lord our God, who livest in the highest. Psalm 112:5. And lookest upon the lowly of the earth. Admirable are all thy works, most high and exalted in thy designs. The supernal Prince Gabriel, obeying with singular delight the divine command, and accompanied by many thousands of most beautiful angels in visible forms, descended from the highest heaven. The appearance of the great Prince and Legate was that of a most handsome youth of rarest beauty. His face emitted resplendent rays of light, his bearing was grave and majestic, his advance measured, his motions composed, his words weighty and powerful. His whole presence displayed a pleasing, kindly gravity, and more of godlike qualities than all the other angels until then seen in visible form by the heavenly Mistress. He wore a diadem of exquisite splendor, and his vestments glowed in various colors full of refulgent beauty. Enchased on his breast he bore a most beautiful cross, disclosing the mystery of the Incarnation, which he had come to announce. All these circumstances were calculated to rivet the affectionate attention of the most prudent Queen. The whole of this celestial army, with their princely leader, holy Gabriel, directed their flight to Nazareth, a town of the province of Galilee, to the dwelling place of most holy Mary. This was a humble cottage, and her chamber was a narrow room, bare of all those furnishings which are wont to be used by the world in order to hide its own meanness and want of all higher goods. The heavenly Mistress was at this time 14 years, 6 months and 17 days of age, for her birthday anniversary fell on the 8th of September, and 6 months 17 days had passed since that date, when this greatest of all mysteries ever performed by God in this world was enacted in her. The bodily shape of the heavenly Queen was well proportioned and taller than is usual with other maidens of her age, yet extremely elegant and perfect in all its parts. Her face was rather more oblong than round, gracious and beautiful, without leanness or grossness. its complexion clear, yet of a slightly brownish hue, her forehead spacious yet symmetrical, her eyebrows perfectly arched, her eyes large and serious, of incredible and ineffable beauty and dove-like sweetness, dark in color with a mixture tending toward green, her nose straight and well shaped, her mouth small, with red colored lips, neither too thin nor too thick. All the gifts of nature in her were so symmetrical and beautiful that no other human being ever had the like. To look upon her caused feelings at the same time of joy and seriousness, love and reverential fear. She attracted the heart and yet restrained it in sweet reverence. Her beauty impelled the tongue to sound her praise, and yet her grandeur and her overwhelming perfections and graces hushed it to silence. In all that approached her, she caused divine effects not easily explained. She filled the heart with heavenly influences and divine operations, tending toward the divinity. Her garments were humble and poor, yet clean, of a dark silvery hue, somewhat like the color of ashes, and they were arranged and worn without pretense, but with the greatest modesty and propriety. At the time when, without her noticing it, the embassy of heaven drew nigh unto her, she was engaged in the highest contemplation concerning the mysteries which the Lord had renewed in her by so many favors during the 9 preceding days. And since, as we have said above, the Lord himself had assured her that his only begotten would soon descend to assume human form, this great Queen was full of fervent and joyful affection at the expectation of its execution, and inflamed with humble love. She spoke in her heart: "Is it possible that the blessed time has arrived in which the Word of the Eternal Father is to be born and to converse with men?" Baruch 10:38. That the world should possess him, that men are able to see him in the flesh. Isaiah 40:5. That his inaccessible light is to shine forth to illumine those who sit in darkness. Isaiah 9:2. O who shall be worthy to see and know him? O who shall be allowed to kiss the earth touched by his feet? Rejoice, ye heavens, and console thyself, O earth. Psalm 95:11. Let all these things bless and extol him, since already his eternal happiness is nigh. O children of Adam, afflicted with sin, and yet creatures of my beloved, now shall you raise your heads and throw off the yoke of your ancient servitude. Isaiah 14:25. O ye ancient forefathers and prophets, and all ye just, that are detained in limbo, and are waiting in the bosom of Abraham, now shall you be consoled, and your much desired and long promised Redeemer shall tarry no longer. Haggai 2:8. Let us all magnify him and sing to him hymns of praise. O who shall be the slave of her, whom Isaiah points out as his mother? Isaiah 7:4. O Emmanuel, true God and man, O key of David, who are to unlock heaven. Isaiah 22:22. O eternal wisdom, O lawgiver of the new church, come to us, O Lord, and end the captivity of thy people. Let all flesh see thy salvation. Isaiah 40:5. In these petitions and aspirations, and in many more too deep for my tongue to explain, the most holy Mary was engaged at that hour when the holy angel Gabriel arrived. She was most pure in soul, most perfect in body, most noble in her sentiments, most exalted in sanctity, full of grace, and so deified and pleasing in the sight of God, that she was fit to be his mother and an instrument adapted for drawing him from the bosom of the Father to her virginal womb. She was the powerful means of our redemption, and to her we owe it on many accounts. And therefore it is just that all generations and nations shall bless and forever extol her. Luke 1:48. What happened at the entrance of the heavenly embassy, I will relate in the following chapter. I wish only to state here a fact worthy of admiration, that for the reception of the message of the archangel and for the execution of the exalted mystery, which was to be wrought in the heavenly Lady by her consent, His Majesty left her without any other aid than the resources of her common human nature, and those furnished her by the faculties and virtues of her ordinary condition, such as have been described in the first part of this history. The Most High disposed it thus because this mystery was to be enacted as a sacrament of faith conjointly with hope and charity, and therefore the Lord provided her with no special aid, leaving her to believe and hope in his divine promises. Thus prepared, she experienced what I shall try to relate in my inadequate and limited terms. The greatness of these sacraments makes my ability to explain them appear so much the more insufficient. Instruction of the Queen of Heaven. My daughter, with special affection I manifest to thee now my will and desire that thou make thyself worthy of the intimate and familiar converse with God, and that for this purpose thou dispose thyself with great zeal and solicitude, weeping over thy sins, and forgetting and rejecting all the visible things, so that thou have no thought henceforth for any other thing outside of God. Therefore thou must begin to practice all that I have taught thee until now, and whatever I will teach thee in the balance of this history. I will accompany thee and guide thee on the course with which thou must maintain in this familiar intercourse and in regard to the favors, which thou receivest through his condescension, entertaining him in thy heart by means of the faith, light and grace given to thee. If thou dost not first conform to this my admonition and prepare thyself accordingly, thou wilt not reach the fulfillment of thy desires, nor shall I reap the fruit of my instructions, which I give to thee as thy teacher. Since thou hast found, without any merit of thine, the hidden treasure and the precious pearl of my teachings and instruction. Matthew 13:44. Despise all other things, in order to possess and secure for thyself this prize of inestimable value, for with it thou shalt receive all other goods, and thou wilt make thyself worthy of the intimate friendship of the Lord and of his perpetual indwelling in your heart. In exchange for this great blessing, I desire that thou die to all earthly things, and that thou offer the thankful love of an entirely purified will. In imitation of me, be thou so humble that, as far as thou art concerned, thou be persuaded and convinced of thy entire worthlessness and incapability, not meriting to be considered even as a slave of the servants of Christ. Remember, I was far from imagining that the Most High had designed me for the dignity of Mother of God, and this was my state of mind, although He had already promised his speedy coming into the world, and although He had commanded me to desire after Him with such great affection that on the day before the execution of this mystery, I thought I would die, and my heart would burst with loving sighs, if the divine providence had not comforted me. He dilated my spirit with the firm hope that the only begotten of the eternal Father would descend from heaven without delay. Yet on the other hand, my humility inclined me to fear, lest my presence in the world might perhaps retard his coming. Contemplate then, my beloved, this secret of my breast, and what an example it is for thee and for all the mortals. And since it is difficult for thee to understand and describe such high wisdom, look upon me in the Lord, in order that by his divine light thou mayest meditate and comprehend the perfection of my actions, follow me by imitating me, and walk in my footsteps. End of chapter 10. Book 1, Chapter 11 of the Mystical City of God, Volume 2, by the Venerable Sister Mary of Jesus of Ágreda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 11. Mary listens to the message of the Holy Angel. The mystery of the Incarnation is enacted by the conception of the Eternal Word in her womb. I wish to confess before heaven and earth and its inhabitants, and in the presence of the Creator of the universe and the eternal God, that in setting myself to write of the profound mystery of the Incarnation, my feeble strength deserts me, my tongue is struck mute, my discourse is silenced, my faculties are benumbed, my understanding is eclipsed and overwhelmed by the divine light, which guides and instructs me. In it all is perceived without error and without any deviousness. I see my insignificance, and I am made aware of the emptiness of words and the insufficiency of human terms for doing justice to my concepts of this sacrament, which comprehends at one and the same time God himself and the greatest and most wonderful work of his omnipotence. I see in this mystery the divine and admirable harmony of his infinite providence and wisdom, with which from all eternity he has ordained and prearranged it, and by which he directed all creation toward its fulfillment. All his works and all his creatures were only well-adjusted means of advancing toward this apex of his aims, the condescension of a God in assuming human nature. I saw that the eternal Word had waited and chosen as the most opportune time and hour for his descent from the bosom of the Father, the midnight of mortal perversion. Wisdom 18:14. When the whole posterity of Adam was buried and absorbed in the sleep of forgetfulness and ignorance of their true God, and when there was no one to open his mouth in confessing and blessing him, except some chosen souls among his people. All the rest of the world was lost in silent darkness, having passed a protracted night of 5,000 and about 200 years. Age had succeeded age, and generations followed upon generations, each one in the time predestined and decreed by the eternal wisdom, each also having an opportunity to know and find him, its creator. For all had him so nigh to them that he gave them life, movement and existence within their own selves. The Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, verse 28. But as the clear day of his inaccessible light had not arrived, though some of the mortals, like the blind, came nigh to him and touched him in his creatures, yet they did not attain to his divinity. Romans chapter 1, verse 23. And in failing to recognize him, they cast themselves upon the sensible and most vile things of the earth. The day then had arrived in which the Most High, setting aside the long ages of this dark ignorance, resolved to manifest himself to men and begin the redemption of the human race by assuming their nature in the womb of most holy Mary, now prepared for this event. In order to be able to describe what was revealed concerning this event to me, it is necessary to make mention of some hidden sacraments connected with the descent of the only begotten from the bosom of the Father. I assume as firmly established what the Holy Faith teaches in regard to the divine persons, that although there is a real personal distinction between the three persons, yet there is no inequality in wisdom, omnipotence, or other attributes, just as little as there is in the divine nature. And just as they are equal in dignity and infinite in perfection, so they are also in these operations ad extra, which proceed from God himself for the production of some creature or temporal object. These operations are indivisibly wrought by three divine persons, for not one person alone produces them, but all three persons insofar as they are one and the same God, possessing one and the same wisdom, one and the same understanding and will. Thus what the Son knows and wishes, that also the Father knows and wishes, and so also the Holy Ghost knows and wishes whatever is known and willed by the Father and the Son. In this indivisibility of action, the three persons wrought and executed by one and the same act the mystery of the Incarnation, although only the person of the Son accepted for himself the nature of man, uniting it to himself hypostatically. Therefore we say that the Son was sent by the eternal Father, from whose intelligence he proceeds, and that the Father sent him by the intervening operations of the Holy Ghost. As it was the person of the Son which came to be made man, this same person, before descending from the heavens and the bosom of the Father, in the name of that same humanity to be received by him, made a conditional request, that on account of his foreseen merits, his salvation and satisfaction of the divine justice for sins be extended to the whole human race. He desired the fiat or ratification of the most blessed will of the Father who sent him, for the acceptance of this redemption by means of his most holy works and his passion, and through the mysteries, which he was to enact in the new church and in the law of grace. The Eternal Father accepted this petition and the foreseen merits of the Word. He conceded all that was proposed and asked for the mortals, and he himself confirmed the elect and predestined souls as the inheritance and possession of Christ forever. Hence Christ himself, our Lord, through Saint John, says that he has not lost nor has allowed to perish those whom the Father has given him. John 18:9. In another place it is said, that no one shall snatch his sheep from his hands, nor from those of his Father. John 17:12. The same would hold good of all those that are born, if they would avail themselves of the redemption, which as it is sufficient, should also be efficacious for all and in all, since his divine mercy desires to exclude no one, if only all of them would make themselves capable of receiving its benefits through the Redeemer. All this, according to our understanding, happened in heaven at the throne of the most blessed Trinity as a prelude to the fiat of the most holy Mary, of which I will presently speak. At the moment in which the only begotten of the Father descended to her virginal womb, all the heavens and the creatures were set in commotion. On account of the inseparable union of the divine persons, the three of them descended with the Word, though the Word alone was to become incarnate. And with the Lord their God, all the hosts of the celestial army issued from heaven, full of invincible strength and splendor. Although it was not necessary to prepare the way, since the Divinity fills the universe, is present in all places, and cannot be impeded by anything. Nevertheless, all the 11 material heavens showed deference to their Creator, and, together with the inferior elements, opened up and parted as it were, for his passage. The stars shone with greater brilliance, the moon and sun with the planets hastened their course in the service of their Maker, anxious to witness the greatness of his wonderful works. Mortals did not perceive this commotion and renewal of all the creatures, both because it happened during the night, as well as because the Lord wished it to be known only to the angels. These with new wonder praised him, knowing these profound and venerable mysteries to be hidden from men. For they knew that men were far removed from understanding these wonderful benefits, so admirable even in the eyes of angelic spirits. To these angelic spirits alone was at that time assigned the duty of giving glory, praise and reverence for these benefits to their Maker. However, in the hearts of some of the just, the Most High infused at that hour a new feeling and affection of extraordinary joy, of which they became conscious. They conceived new and grand ideas concerning the Lord. Some of them were inspired and began to confer within themselves, whether this new sensation, which they felt, was not the effect of the coming of the Messias in order to redeem the world. But all this remained concealed, for each one thought that he alone had experienced this renewal of his interior. In the other creatures there was a like renovation and change. The birds moved about with new songs and joyousness. The plants and trees gave forth more fruit and fragrance. And in like proportion, all the rest of the creatures received and felt some kind of vivifying change. But among those that received the greatest share were the fathers and saints in limbo, whither the archangel Michael was sent with the glad message, in order to console them and cause in them the fullness of jubilee and praise. Only for hell it was a cause of new consternation and grief, for at the descent of the eternal Word from on high, the demons felt an impetuous force of the divine power, which came upon them like the waves of the sea and buried all of them in the deepest caverns of their darkness, without leaving them any strength of resistance or recovery. When by divine permission they were again able to rise, they poured forth upon the world and hastened about to discover what strange happenings had thus undone them. However, although they held several conferences among themselves, they were unable to find the cause. The divine power concealed from them the sacrament of the Incarnation and the manner in which most holy Mary conceived the incarnate Word. Not until the death of Christ on the cross did they arrive at the certainty that he was God and true man, as we shall there relate. In order that the mystery of the Most High might be fulfilled, the holy archangel Gabriel, in the shape described in the preceding chapter, and accompanied by innumerable angels in visible human forms and resplendent with incomparable beauty, entered into the chamber where most holy Mary was praying. It was on a Thursday at 6 o'clock in the evening and at the approach of night. The great modesty and restraint of the Princess of Heaven did not permit her to look at him more than was necessary to recognize him as an angel of the Lord. Recognizing him as such, she, in her usual humility, wished to do him reverence. The holy prince would not allow it. On the contrary, he himself bowed profoundly as before his Queen and Mistress, in whom he adored the heavenly mysteries of his Creator. At the same time he understood that from that day on the ancient times and the custom of old whereby men should worship angels as Abraham had done (Genesis 28:2) were changed. For as human nature was raised to the dignity of God himself in the person of the Word, men now held the position of adopted children, of companions and brethren of the angels, as the angel said to the evangelist Saint John when he refused to be worshipped (Apocalypse 19:10). The holy archangel saluted our and his Queen and said: Ave gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus. Luke 1:28. Hearing this new salutation of the angel, this most humble of all creatures was disturbed, but not confused in mind. Luke 1:29. This disturbance arose from two causes. First, from her humility, for she thought herself the lowest of the creatures, and thus in her humility was taken unawares at hearing herself saluted and called the blessed among women. Secondly, when she heard this salute and began to consider within herself how she should receive it, she was interiorly made to understand by the Lord that He chose her for his mother, and this caused a still greater perturbance, having such a humble opinion of herself. On account of this perturbance, the angel proceeded to explain to her the decree of the Lord, saying: Do not fear, Mary, for thou hast found grace before the Lord. Luke 1:30. Behold, thou shalt conceive a son in thy womb, and thou shalt give birth to him, and thou shalt name him Jesus. He shall be great, and he shall be called Son of the Most High. And the rest as recorded of the holy archangel. Our most prudent and humble Queen alone, among all the creatures, was sufficiently intelligent and magnanimous to estimate at its true value such a new and unheard of sacrament. And in proportion as she realized its greatness, so she was also moved with admiration. But she raised her humble heart to the Lord, who could not refuse her any petition, and in the secret of her spirit she asked new light and assistance by which to govern herself in such an arduous transaction. For, as we have said in the preceding chapter, the Most High, in order to permit her to act in this mystery solely in faith, hope, and charity, left her in the common state and suspended all other kinds of favors and interior elevations, which she so frequently and continually enjoyed. In this disposition she replied and said to holy Gabriel what is written in Saint Luke: How shall this happen, that I conceive and bear, since I know not, nor can know, man? At the same time, she interiorly represented to the Lord the vow of chastity, which she had made, and the espousal which his Majesty had celebrated with her. The holy Prince Gabriel replied (Luke 1:24). Lady, it is easy for the divine power to make thee a mother without the cooperation of man. The Holy Spirit shall remain with thee by a new presence, and the virtue of the Most High shall overshadow thee, so that the Holy of Holies can be born of thee, who shall himself be called the Son of God. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth has likewise conceived a son in her sterile years, and this is the 6th month of her conception, for nothing is impossible with God. He that can make her conceive, who was sterile, can bring about that thou, Lady, be his mother, still preserving thy virginity and enhancing thy purity. To the Son whom thou shalt bear, God will give the throne of his father David, and his reign shall be everlasting in the house of Jacob. Thou art not ignorant, O Lady, of the prophecy of Isaiah. Isaiah 7:14. That a virgin shall conceive and shall bear a son, whose name shall be Emmanuel, God with us. This prophecy is infallible, and it shall be fulfilled in thy person. Thou knowest also of the great mystery of the bush, which Moses saw burning without its being consumed by the fire. Exodus 3:2. This signified that the two natures, divine and human, are to be united in such a manner that the latter is not consumed by the divine, and that the mother of the Messias shall conceive and give birth without violation of her virginal purity. Remember also, Lady, the promise of the eternal God to the patriarch Abraham, that after the captivity of his posterity for 4 generations, they should return to this land, the mysterious signification of which was that in this, the 4th generation, the incarnate God is to rescue the whole race of Adam through thy cooperation from the oppression of the devil. Genesis 15:16. And the ladder which Jacob saw in his sleep, Genesis 28:12, was an express figure of the royal way, which the eternal Word was to open up, and by which the mortals are to ascend to heaven, and the angels to descend to earth. To this earth, the only begotten of the Father shall lower himself in order to converse with men and communicate to them the treasures of his divinity, imparting to them his virtues and his immutable and eternal perfections. With these and many other words the ambassador of heaven instructed the most holy Mary, in order that, by remembrance of the ancient promises and prophecies of Holy Writ, by the reliance and trust in them and in the infinite power of the Most High, she might overcome her hesitancy at the heavenly message. But as the Lady herself exceeded the angels in wisdom, prudence, and in all sanctity, she withheld her answer, in order to be able to give it in accordance with the divine will, and that it might be worthy of the greatest of all the mysteries and sacraments of the divine power. She reflected that upon her answer depended the pledge of the most blessed Trinity, the fulfillment of his promises and prophecies, the most pleasing and acceptable of all sacrifices, the opening of the gates of paradise, the victory and triumph over hell, the redemption of all the human race, the satisfaction of the divine justice, the foundation of the new law of grace, the glorification of men, the rejoicing of the angels, and whatever was connected with the incarnation of the only begotten of the Father and his assuming the form of servant in her virginal womb. Letter to the Philippians, 2:7. A great wonder indeed, and worthy of our admiration, that all these mysteries and whatever others they included should be entrusted by the Almighty to a humble maiden and made dependent upon her fiat. But befittingly and securely he left them to the wise and strong decision of this courageous woman. Proverbs 31:11. Since she would consider them with such magnanimity and nobility, that perforce his confidence in her was not misplaced. The operations which proceed within the divine essence depend not on the cooperation of creatures, for they have no part in them, and God could not expect such cooperations for executing the works ad intra, but in the works ad extra, and such as were contingent, among which that of becoming man was the most exalted. He could not proceed without the cooperation of most holy Mary and without her free consent, for he wished to reach this acme of all the works outside himself, in her and through her, and he wished that we should owe this benefit to this Mother of wisdom and our reparatrix. Therefore this great Lady considered and inspected profoundly this spacious field of the dignity of Mother of God. Proverbs 21:11. In order to purchase it by her fiat, she clothed herself in fortitude more than human, and she tasted and saw how profitable was this enterprise and commerce with the Divinity. She comprehended the ways of his hidden benevolence and adorned herself with fortitude and beauty. And having conferred with herself and with the heavenly messenger Gabriel about the grandeur of these high and divine sacraments, and finding herself in excellent condition to receive the message sent to her, her purest soul was absorbed and elevated in admiration, reverence, and highest intensity of divine love. By the intensity of these movements and supernal affections, her most pure heart, as it were, by natural consequence, was contracted and compressed with such force that it distilled 3 drops of her most pure blood, and these, finding their way to the natural place for the act of conception, were formed by the power of the divine and Holy Spirit into the body of Christ our Lord. Thus the matter, from which the most holy humanity of the Word for our redemption is composed, was furnished and administered by the most pure heart of Mary, and through the sheer force of her true love. At the same moment, with the humility never sufficiently to be extolled, inclining slightly her head and joining her hands, she pronounced these words, which were the beginning of our salvation: Fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum. Luke 1:31. At the pronouncing of this fiat, so sweet to the hearing of God and so fortunate for us, in one instant 4 things happened. First, the most holy body of Christ our Lord was formed from the 3 drops of blood furnished by the heart of most holy Mary. Secondly, the most holy soul of the same Lord was created, just as the other souls. Thirdly, the soul and the body united in order to compose his perfect humanity. Fourthly, the divinity united itself in the person of the Word with the humanity, which together became one composite being in hypostatical union, and thus was formed Christ true God and man, our Lord and Redeemer. This happened in springtime on the 25th of March, at break or dawning of the day, in the same hour in which our first father Adam was made, and in the year of the creation of the world 5199, which agrees also with the count of the Roman Church in her martyrology under the guidance of the Holy Ghost. This reckoning is the true and certain one, as was told me, when I inquired at command of my superiors. Conformable to this, the world was created in the month of March, which corresponds to the beginning of creation. And as the works of the Most High are perfect and complete. Deuteronomy 32:4. The plants and trees come forth from the hands of his Majesty bearing fruit, and they would have borne them continually without intermission, if sin had not changed the whole nature, as I will expressly relate in another treatise, if it is the will of the Lord. Now, however, I will detain myself therewith, since it does not pertain to our subject. In the same instant in which the Almighty celebrated the nuptials of the hypostatic union in the womb of most holy Mary, the heavenly Lady was elevated to the beatific vision, and the divinity manifested itself to her clearly and intuitively. She saw most high sacraments, of which I will speak in the next chapter. The mysteries of the inscriptions with which she was adorned, and which the angels exhibited as related in the 7th chapter, were made clear to her, each in particular. The divine child began to grow in the natural manner in the recesses of the womb, being nourished by the substance and the blood of the most holy Mother, just as other men. Yet it was more free and exempt from imperfections, to which other children of Adam are subject in that place and period. For from some of these, namely those that are accidental and unnecessary to the substance of the act of generation, being merely effects of sin, the Empress of Heaven was free. She was also free from the superfluities caused by sin, which in other women are common and happen naturally in the formation, sustenance, and growth of their children. For the necessary matter, which is proper to the infected nature of the descendants of Eve, and which was wanting in her, was supplied and administered in her by the exercise of heroic acts of virtue and especially by charity. By the fervor of her soul and her loving affections, the blood and humors of her body were changed, and thereby divine providence provided for the sustenance of the divine child. Thus in a natural manner the humanity of our Redeemer was nourished, while his divinity was recreated and pleased with her heroic virtues. Most holy Mary furnished to the Holy Ghost for the formation of this body pure and limpid blood, free from sin and all its tendencies. And whatever impure and imperfect matter is supplied by other mothers for the growth of their children was administered by the Queen of Heaven, most pure and delicate in substance. For it was built up and supplied by the power of her loving affections and her other virtues. In a like manner was purified whatever served as food for the heavenly Queen. For as she knew that her nourishment was at the same time to sustain and nourish the Son of God, she partook of it with such heroic acts of virtue that the angelic spirits wondered how such common human actions could be connected with such supernal heights of merit and perfection in the sight of God. The heavenly Lady was thus established in such high privileges in her position as Mother of God, that those which I have already mentioned and which I shall yet mention convey not even the smallest idea of her excellence, and my tongue cannot describe it. For neither is it possible to conceive it by the understanding, nor can the most learned, nor the most wise of men find adequate terms to express it. The humble who are proficient in the art of divine love become aware of it by infused light and by the interior taste and feeling, by which such sacraments are perceived. Not only was most holy Mary become a heaven, a temple and dwelling place of the most holy Trinity, transformed thereto, elevated and made godlike by the special and unheard of operation of the Divinity in her most pure womb, but her humble cottage and her poor little oratory was consecrated by the Divinity as a new sanctuary of God. The heavenly spirits, who as witnesses of this marvelous transformation were present to contemplate it, magnified the Lord with ineffable praise and jubilee. In union with this most happy Mother, they blessed Him in his name and in the name of the human race, which was ignorant of this greatest of his benefits and mercies. Instruction of the most holy Queen Mary. My daughter, thou art filled with astonishment at seeing, by means of new light, the mystery of the humiliation of the Divinity in uniting Himself with the human nature in the womb of a poor maiden such as I was. I wish, however, my dearest, that thou turn thy attention toward thyself and consider how God humiliated Himself and came into my womb, not only for myself alone, but for thee as well. The Lord is infinite in his mercy, and his love has no limits, and thus He attends and esteems and assists every soul who receives Him, and He rejoices in it as if He had created it alone, and as if He had been made man for it alone. Therefore, with all the affection of thy soul, thou must, as it were, consider thyself as being thyself in person, bound to render the full measure of thanks of all the world for his coming, and for his coming to redeem all. And if, with a lively faith, thou art convinced and confessest, that the same God who, infinite in his attributes and eternal in his majesty, lowered Himself to assume human flesh in my womb, seeks also thee, calls thee, rejoices thee, caresses thee, and thinks of thee alone, as if thou wert his only creature. Letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20. Think well and reflect to what his admirable condescension obliges thee. Convert this admiration into living acts of faith and love, for that He condescends to come to thee, thou owest entirely to the goodness of the King and Savior, since thou thyself couldst never find Him nor attain Him. Considering merely that which this Lord can give thee outside of Himself, it will appear to thee grand, even when thou perceivest it only by a mere human intelligence and affection. It is certainly true that any gift from such an eminent and supreme King is worthy of all estimation. But when thou beginst to consider and know by divine light, that this gift is God himself, and that He makes thee partaker of his divinity, when thou wilt understand, that without thy God and without his coming, all creation would be as nothing and despicable in thy sight, thou wouldst want to enjoy thyself and find rest only in the consciousness of possessing such a God, so loving, so amiable, so powerful, sweet and affluent, who, being such a great and infinite God, humiliates himself to thy lowliness in order to raise thee from the dust and enrich thy poverty, performing toward thee the duties of a shepherd, of a father, a spouse, and most faithful friend. Attend therefore, my daughter, in the secret of thy heart to all the consequences of these truths. Ponder and confer within thyself about this sweetest love of the great King for thee. how faithful He is in his gifts and caresses, in his favors, in the works confided to thee, in the enlightenment of thy interior, instructing thee by divine science in the infinite greatness of his being, in his admirable works and most hidden mysteries, in universal truth and in the nothingness of visible existence. This science is the first beginning and principle, the basis and foundation of the knowledge, which I have given thee in order that thou mayest attain to the decorum and magnanimity with which thou art to treat the favors and benefits of this thy Lord and God, thy true blessedness, thy treasure, thy light, and thy guide. Look upon him as upon the infinite God, loving yet terrible. Listen, my dearest, to my words, to my teachings and discipline, for therein are contained the peace and the enlightenment of thy soul. Chapter 12.